what happened. Strangely, when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, that standard is never used. And the reason is pretty straightforward. Because if you look at what the human rights organizations have to say, uniformly, I mean all the human rights organizations, it doesn't cast Israel, it doesn't put Israel in a very good light. So let's take the most recent case. Most of you in this room have, of course, heard of the name Richard Goldstone. How many of you have heard of his name? Raise your hand. Okay, not so high. Okay. So Mr. Goldstone produces a report on what happened during the Gaza invasion. And there is this huge hysteria over this report. And the media immediately start to call it Richard Goldstone's controversial report on Gaza. It's controversial. It's an odd description. Why is it odd? Because Mr. Goldstone's report was not the first human rights report on what happened in Gaza. It was the last of approximately 12 large human rights reports on Gaza. There were 2 very large reports by Amnesty International, excellent reports. There were 5 human rights reports on Gaza by Human Rights Watch. There was a major report by a committee headed by the distinguished South African legal scholar John Dugard, a very large report that ran to about 270 pages. There were reports by Physicians for Human Rights in Israel. There was a report by an international committee of medical experts, and it goes on and on. There was nothing that Mr. Goldstone concluded in his report that wasn't already concluded by all the other human rights organizations. With all due respect to him, and I think his was an excellent report, it was in many respects the most moderate of the human rights reports. To give you a couple of examples, Human Rights Watch concluded that when Israel dropped white phosphorus reaches a temperature of 800 degrees Celsius. When Israel dropped white phosphorus on Al-Quds Hospital, when it dropped white phosphorus on the Beit Lahia School, when it dropped white phosphorus on the main humanitarian warehouse for the UN in Gaza, Human Rights Watch said these were war crimes. Mr. Goldstone was more cautious. He did not call them war crimes. I personally disagree with him, But still, for our purposes, the important point is he was more moderate than the other respected human rights organizations. Let's take a second example. Mr. Goldstone said his most extreme conclusion was that if Israel does not carry out serious investigations of what happened during the Gaza invasion, he said then Israel should be brought before the International Criminal Court, which is strong language for sure, and to his credit. But we have to bear in mind, Amnesty International put out a very substantial report in which it said Israel has become such a consistent violator of human rights that the United Nations should impose a total arms embargo on Israel and Hamas. Hamas, of course, it means nothing. You know, an arms embargo on firecrackers is not going to mean very much. But it was very significant to say the entire world, and they focused in particular on the United States. All the white phosphorus weapons used in Gaza, all of the white phosphorus, and they showed the pictures. They were all made in the United States. And Amnesty said there should be a total arms embargo on Israel. That's serious business. Again, with all due respect to Mr. Goldstone's report, he never went that far. And so, what you find when you look at the actual record, number one, it's very hard to try to explain why Mr. Goldstone would be attacking Israel unless there was good reason. Mr. Goldstone is Jewish. He says he's a Zionist. He says he believes in the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. He tells you his mother was an active Zionist. He tells you his daughter is an active Zionist. He sits on the board of governors of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He has an honorary degree from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He says, I've worked my whole adult life for Israel. So just on its face, it would seem weird that Mr. Goldstone would be criticizing Israel unless there were very good grounds to criticize Israel. So to call Mr. Goldstone, of all people, controversial is already strange. But it becomes much more strange when you see that all the other human rights organizations were as critical, if not more critical, than Mr. Goldstone in their depiction, in their portrayal of what happened in Gaza. In the real world, and I'm distinguishing the real world from the world that's created by the media, in the real world, there is no controversy about what happened in Gaza. Obvious, simple examples. Israel targeted ambulances in Gaza. It damaged or destroyed 29 ambulances.